Hi everyone, Ian from Bristol Ground School here. In other videos I talk about what life might be like when you join an airline, the kind of training you will undergo, reporting for a flight, the kind of things you do at the beginning of a typical day's flying. In this video I want to look back on some of the things I wish I'd known when I started my flying career. Now, when I studied for the ATPL exams, there were no online question banks that you could just peruse at your leisure, compare with other question banks and get to know all the questions really well. The internet, whilst it existed, wasn't that long ago, was still quite underdeveloped and pretty slow. Most people had dial-up internet, which meant that your modem had to dial the internet service provider and wait to be connected. It's like making a phone call, and it was really slow. But there were still question banks. Ground schools like Bristol Ground School had a paper bank of questions, gathered, as they are now, by student feedback. And so revision weeks focused on working through these questions because it was really the only time you would get to see any of the typical questions that came up. I mean, it's fair to say that, like many students now, I did rely quite heavily on the question banks and familiarity with the questions and the style of questions to pass my exams. Well, all that came undone when I joined an airline because my first type rating was on a 737 and the CBT was really hard work. It was like I was learning the stuff for the first time. I mean, I had some required knowledge but didn't really understand much. And this was particularly true when it came to performance. Sim instructors, they were talking about net takeoff flight paths, safety factors, assumed temperatures, thrust drag relationship and so on. I had no idea what they were talking about. So I had to dig out my ATPL books and start cramming in the knowledge and understanding that I should have gained in the first place. And it left me with a lot of catching up to do at a time when I'm trying to get through a type rating. And as I talk about in another video, the type rating is intense, and so you don't really have the time to catch up on what you missed during your ATPL studies because you were relying too much on the question banks. So I wish I'd spent more time studying and understanding the theory because the question banks, sure, they'll help you pass the exam, but ATPL theory will help get you through the rest of the career. Another area of knowledge I didn't have much of at the time was flight time limitations. Something that wasn't really a problem until I became a captain, because at that point you really need to know the flight time limitations because other crew members and my legal obligations as a captain depended on that knowledge. Air law is perhaps for most students the one subject that sends them to sleep, I think. I mean, it's hard to wade through all the legalised language and make sense of it all, particularly since many pilot trainees tend to be more STEM based, that's their tech brain, rather than linguistically minded. But even for avid readers of literature, legal text can be impenetrable without the kind of focused close reading that, well, let's be honest, doesn't seem worth it when you have question banks to help you out. But there are important points to be taken from the air law syllabus, and flight time limitations is one of them. You can't rely on your company's rostering or crewing departments to stay within the confines of what's legal. I mean, they might, if they try, of course. They don't do anything deliberately that's counter to the legal requirements. But the stresses of trying to crew flights during periods of disruption can and does sometimes lead to unintentional flight time limitation violations, FTL violations. And rostering software isn't infallible either. So as far as the law is concerned, it's the crew member, you, that needs to ensure you operate within the legal parameters. The first time this became clear to me was in my first year as a pilot when, after a delay, I inadvertently exceeded FDP, max FDP, flight duty period, and was taken off the next day's duty to extend my rest period. I had to file an ASR and so on. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was embarrassing that I didn't know the rules. So I had to get the books out again and start studying. Another one, I once said to a captain, again in my first few months of flying, that I think there's a new procedure that differed from the one he was doing. I can't remember what it was now, it's not important now. But I was convinced I'd learnt this new SOP during the type rating. And he looked at me and said, "Where does it say that?" And I shrugged and said, "I don't know, in the manual, I suppose." So I had to spend the rest of the flight trying to find the proof of this new SOP to back up my claim. I couldn't. The sim instructor during training didn't work for the company I was then working for, so probably had taught me something that he'd used during his company when he was still flying. But the point is, you need to know where everything is in your manuals. You need to be able to find the information you're looking for quickly. And this means knowing which manual to look in, Part A, Part B of the FCOM, and which chapter it might be in. One of the reasons for this is so important is because we can never know everything about the aircraft. We're never going to know everything about company policies, the regulations, the law, etc. You're never going to know which aerodrome light degradation we can accept for a Cat 3A approach or Cat 3B approach or whatever during LVPs. So you need to know where to find this information, and you need to be able to find it quickly. So the key message then is make sure you know the company manuals backwards by the time you start flying their planes. And I mean just know where to find everything quickly. After my type rating, and before I actually flew on the line, I was at my parents' house in Cheshire, over which flights into Manchester and Liverpool regularly passed. And I looked up and I saw an EasyJet, I think it was, going into Liverpool, with still some way to go, or it seemed to me. Plane was about 2,000 feet, the gear was down, and I thought, well, that's not right. Now, regardless of which airline it is, the position and non-position approach profiles you learn in the sim are much the same. First stage of flap on base, next stage on the ILS intercept, gear down at 6 miles and so on. Now, this guy seemed way too low for where he was, and why would the gear be down already? That's what I was thinking. I was telling my parents that, oh, he's not doing something right here. From my absolutely zero experience of flying at this stage, except in a simulator. Well, what I discovered when I started to fly the actual planes was that the profiles you learn in the sim are just ideal profiles that give you a framework. Just to give you an idea of the sequence of events for preparing for the approach. And they're not always followed in real life because you have ATC, you have airspace restrictions, you have other aeroplanes around. So it seems the aircraft I'd seen going into Liverpool was probably doing a visual approach or just a shortened approach, a tight left base, because of airspace conflict with Manchester. And so he was lower than I would expect. He was already configured at a position where, according to the standard profile, they should be heading downwind for another 10 miles at 3,000 feet. So adapting to real life flying and learning to use different control modes, like vertical speed instead of open descent, and descending earlier than expected, intercepting the ILS below platform, and so on, was something I hadn't expected at all. Passing the type rating is like passing your driving test. It's after that when you really start learning how to fly the planes. So these are some of the things I wish I'd known when I started out, and perhaps you could bear them in mind when you start out. So that's it for now. We'll see you next time.